Hollywood thought time would do the dirty work. Stay quiet long enough, and the noise fades. Reputations blur. Memories soften. Careers quietly close. That was the plan. But Johnny Depp didn't disappear. He didn't rush for sympathy. He didn't beg for a comeback. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to the system that wrote him off. He waited. And while the industry tried to move on, audiences didn't. Roles vanished, headlines changed, invitations stopped. Yet something unexpected happened behind the scenes. The silence started speaking louder than any press release. Because when Hollywood turns its back, it expects obedience. What it never expects is resistance without permission. They expected him to fade quietly, because that is how Hollywood usually resets the board. One controversy, one narrative locked in early, and the machine keeps rolling forward without looking back. Studios protect schedules, not people. Brands protect optics, not nuance. When the noise around Johnny Depp reached its peak, doors didn't slam dramatically. They closed politely. Meetings stopped happening. Calls went unanswered. Projects were reconsidered. The word used most often wasn't punishment, it was distance. And distance can end a career faster than rejection ever could. For years, Depp had been one of the most bankable faces in cinema. From eccentric leads to billion-dollar franchises, his presence wasn't just artistic, it was financial. That's why the shift was so sudden and so quiet. One day his name anchored release schedules. The next, it was treated like a risk disclaimer. What made this moment different wasn't just the allegations swirling in public, it was how fast the industry chose a side without waiting for clarity. No long investigation. No pause to verify. The assumption was simple. Time will erase him, and the audience will accept the replacement. But something didn't follow the usual script. While headlines simplified the story into clean villains and heroes, details started leaking out in less controlled spaces. Court documents, audio clips submitted as evidence, witness testimonies that didn't fit the viral summaries. In 2020, during the UK libel case involving a British newspaper, judge rulings were reported widely, but very few people actually read the transcripts. Later, when the US defamation trial took place in Virginia, cameras changed everything. For the first time, the public wasn't relying on filtered summaries. They were watching hours of testimony unfold in real time. This mattered more than Hollywood realized. Because audiences don't behave like studios. Studios move by risk management. Audiences move by instinct. And instinct notices inconsistency. Viewers saw text messages read in full context. They heard recordings played without commentary. They watched experts cross-examined. Regardless of where someone landed emotionally, the idea that the situation was simple collapsed. Complexity returned. Doubt returned. And once doubt enters a locked narrative, control starts slipping. Depp didn't dominate the courtroom theatrically. He spoke slowly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes uncomfortably honest. When questioned about his career, he didn't frame himself as a victim of fame. He described a man watching his life's work erode in real time. During testimony, he said losing his reputation felt like losing everything in one day. That line spread because it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded tired. What Hollywood underestimated was that silence can be strategic without being calculated. While studios erased his name from upcoming projects, Depp stayed largely absent from press tours and sympathy circuits. He didn't flood social media with statements. He didn't rebrand himself as misunderstood. Instead, he let the process expose what press cycles couldn't fully bury. According to court records and later interviews, he turned down several opportunities to soften the narrative through controlled appearances. He chose risk over image repair. Meanwhile, the industry did what it always does in uncomfortable moments. It replaced him. Franchises moved forward. Contracts were rewritten. Public statements emphasized values and standards without addressing evidence. The message was subtle but clear: we are done waiting. But something awkward followed. Replacement projects underperformed. Audience reactions felt colder. Comment sections filled with comparisons no marketing team wanted highlighted. This wasn't about loyalty to one actor. It was about trust. People don't like feeling manipulated. When they sense a conclusion has been forced on them, curiosity turns into resistance. Search trends reflected this shift. Interest in Depp's past work surged during the trial. Clips from older interviews resurfaced, including a 2004 Rolling Stone profile where he openly discussed his distrust of Hollywood systems long before any legal trouble. Back then, it sounded eccentric. Years later, it sounded prophetic. Even outside the courtroom, industry insiders quietly admitted discomfort. Anonymous agents told trade publications that the speed of the blacklist felt reactionary. Directors who had worked with Depp described him as difficult at times, but not disposable. One cinematographer stated in an interview that Depp was the same chaotic artist he'd always been, and that chaos had once been celebrated, not condemned. The turning point wasn't a verdict alone. It was visibility. When the Virginia jury reached a decision in 2022, the result didn't magically restore his career overnight, but it cracked the narrative wall. Suddenly, the phrase allegations versus evidence entered mainstream conversation again. Even people who remained critical acknowledged the case wasn't one-dimensional. That admission alone was enough to disrupt Hollywood's quiet exit strategy. After the trial, Depp gave a limited interview where he addressed the idea of comeback expectations. He said he wasn't interested in returning to a system that abandoned due process. That sentence mattered because it flipped the power dynamic. Instead of pleading for re-entry, he questioned whether re-entry was even desirable. Shortly after, he appeared at the Cannes Film Festival to a standing ovation for a foreign production, not a studio-backed blockbuster. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Europe welcomed him while Hollywood hesitated. This is where the industry miscalculated again. They assumed relevance only flows through their gates. But the modern audience doesn't need studio permission to validate someone. Independent projects, music performances, art exhibitions, even surprise appearances at concerts began drawing attention. Depp didn't announce a grand return. He reappeared in fragments. Controlled. Deliberate. Human. Meanwhile, executives faced an uncomfortable reality. Removing someone publicly is easy. Explaining why they were removed when evidence becomes messy is harder. Reversing a stance risks admitting haste. Maintaining it risks looking dishonest. So most chose a third option. Silence. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just distance. But distance no longer works in an era where past decisions are archived forever. The story here isn't about declaring someone flawless. It's about watching a system panic when its shortcuts are exposed. Hollywood thrives on speed. Fast casting. Fast judgment. Fast replacement. But truth moves slower, and when it catches up, it doesn't ask for permission. Depp didn't force the industry to face the contradiction. He simply refused to disappear long enough for it to be forgotten. By the time studios realized audiences were no longer aligned with their narrative, the damage was already done. Trust doesn't reset with a press release. It erodes quietly, just like careers do. Except this time, the erosion happened on the other side. And that's the part no one predicted. Hollywood tried to move on. But moving on only works when the audience agrees. The aftermath didn't arrive as a victory lap. There were no studio apologies, no public reversals, no sudden offers announced through trades. Instead, there was something more revealing. Hesitation. The same system that once acted instantly now moved cautiously. Executives watched audience reactions closely. Every mention of his name triggered measurable engagement. Trailers unrelated to him filled with comments asking why he was removed. Brand accounts disabled replies. Silence became a defensive posture. What followed was a slow cultural audit. People began re-examining how easily narratives are accepted when they're delivered with authority. Commentators pointed out that the initial industry response had relied heavily on headlines, not hearings. Legal analysts referenced how defamation standards differ across jurisdictions, something barely discussed during the early outrage phase. The public learned, perhaps uncomfortably, that legal loss does not always equal factual certainty. Nuance, once inconvenient, became unavoidable. Depp's own response to this shift remained restrained. He didn't start a redemption tour. Instead, he returned to the places that never fully left him. Music, art, small-scale storytelling. During a later interview tied to his music projects, he mentioned that creativity had been his anchor when external voices tried to define reality. That line resonated because it framed survival not as revenge, but as preservation. He wasn't trying to correct everyone. He was trying to stay intact. Behind closed doors, the industry recalculated its language. Phrases like brand safety and reputational risk were quietly redefined. Agents acknowledged that audience trust now factored into risk equations just as much as press sentiment. One veteran producer admitted in a recorded panel discussion that the industry had underestimated how much viewers resent being told what conclusions to draw. They don't mind disagreement, he said. They mind being managed. This recalibration didn't restore past franchises, but it opened a new lane. Foreign directors expressed interest. Independent financiers stepped forward. Not because controversy sells, but because resilience does. There's a difference. Controversy fades. Endurance lingers. Depp's continued presence, despite institutional resistance, reframed him from a liability into a case study. Not of innocence or guilt, but of what happens when systems act faster than truth. The cultural conversation widened. People began asking uncomfortable questions beyond one individual. How many careers had ended without evidence ever being fully examined? How many times had silence been mistaken for admission? How often had corporations prioritized optics over process while publicly championing fairness? These weren't fringe discussions anymore. They entered mainstream commentary, podcasts, and university media courses. Hollywood, for its part, avoided addressing these questions directly. It rarely confronts its own reflexes. Instead, it adjusted quietly. Future controversies were met with more cautious language. Pending review replaced immediate action. Legal teams gained more influence over public statements. The Depp situation became an internal reference point, though rarely acknowledged publicly. No one wanted to admit learning the hard way. What makes this story linger isn't a comeback announcement or a box office statistic. It's the shift in power dynamics it exposed. For decades, studios shaped public memory by controlling access. Who gets cast? Who gets interviews? Who gets distribution? But access no longer equals influence. Live streams, court cameras, unedited records, and audience-driven platforms disrupted the monopoly. Depp didn't create those tools. He benefited from their existence at a moment when they mattered most. There's a quiet irony in how this unfolded. The very industry that built his image couldn't dismantle it completely because the audience had already claimed ownership. Characters, performances, years of emotional investment don't vanish on command. They live in people's minds, detached from studio approval. Hollywood forgot that, and forgetting your audience is the fastest way to lose authority. Even now, the relationship remains unresolved. Some studios will never call. Some will wait until distance makes collaboration feel safe again. Some will quietly rewrite history when it becomes convenient. But the myth of total erasure is gone. The assumption that time automatically sides with institutions has been challenged. Depp once said in court testimony that he believed truth eventually surfaces, even if it takes years. Not because systems allow it, but because people look for it. That belief isn't romantic. It's observational. Audiences watched. They listened. They noticed contradictions. And they refused to move on just because they were told to. This doesn't end with a triumphant bow or a clean resolution. Real stories rarely do. It ends in an uncomfortable middle where certainty is replaced by awareness, where industries are reminded they don't own narratives anymore, and where one man, written off as finished, proved that disappearance is not the same as defeat. Hollywood tried to move on, but moving on requires consensus. And this time, the audience chose to stay. What happened next wasn't loud, and that's exactly why it mattered. No press conference. No victory statements. Just a pattern forming in plain sight. Audiences kept pulling him back into relevance without asking permission. Streaming numbers climbed for older films. Comment sections turned into debates about fairness instead of gossip. Reaction videos analyzed testimony instead of tabloid summaries. The culture didn't crown a winner. It questioned the referee. For the first time in a long while, Hollywood wasn't leading the conversation. It was reacting to it. Inside the industry, people talk in signals, not statements. And the signals were everywhere. Casting announcements suddenly emphasized due process. Morality clauses were rewritten with softer language. Legal departments gained final say over public responses, not marketing teams. This wasn't reform. It was damage control shaped by memory. The situation around Johnny Depp became a quiet training module executives never acknowledged using. What made the shift uncomfortable was that it exposed a contradiction. Hollywood brands itself as progressive, thoughtful, principled, but its behavior revealed something more primitive. Fear of backlash outweighs commitment to fairness when decisions must be made fast. And speed has always been the industry's addiction. Fast releases, fast trends, fast judgments. The problem is that truth doesn't operate on deadlines. Depp's refusal to chase rehabilitation forced observers to sit with unresolved tension. He didn't ask to be believed. He asked to be heard. That difference matters. Belief can be emotional. Hearing requires patience. In later public remarks connected to his creative work, he spoke about identity being stripped away piece by piece, not all at once. It's the quiet removal, he said, that does the most damage. Those words aligned uncomfortably well with how the industry works. What audiences saw is not perfection, but persistence. He showed up where he was invited. He worked without spectacle. He accepted applause without demanding absolution. That posture confused a system built on optics. Redemption arcs are supposed to be loud. They're supposed to reassure everyone quickly. This one didn't. It lingered. It stayed complicated. Meanwhile, commentary shifted from personality to precedent. Journalists began asking whether corporate responses to allegations had replaced legal evaluation entirely. Legal scholars cited the case when discussing the difference between public opinion and evidentiary standards. Podcasts dedicated hours to breaking down how narratives form before facts are tested. This wasn't about defending a celebrity. It was about interrogating a process. Hollywood, intentionally or not, had demonstrated how narratives can harden before verification. Once hardened, reversing them risks reputational whiplash. So institutions doubled down. They don't correct. They wait. Waiting used to work. Not anymore. The internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't move on when curiosity remains unsatisfied. Depp's continued relevance became proof of that failure. Not because he dominated screens again, but because he remained visible without institutional support. That visibility undermined the myth that studios control legitimacy. Legitimacy now comes from endurance, from consistency, from refusing to rewrite yourself to fit the moment. There's a reason the industry never formally revisited its early decisions. Doing so would require admitting uncertainty at the moment certainty was publicly projected. Power structures hate that. They prefer clean narratives, even when reality is messy. But the audience has grown allergic to overly clean stories. They sense when complexity has been sanded down for comfort. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud. The fear wasn't about being wrong. It was about being exposed as impulsive. The trial footage didn't just reveal personal conflict. It revealed how quickly institutions act when reputational risk enters the room. How little patience exists for process when headlines move faster than facts. Depp didn't weaponize that exposure. He didn't tour studios demanding accountability. He simply kept existing in public view, unchanged. And that steadiness did something unexpected. It made the initial reaction look panicked by comparison. Over time, panic ages badly. Now, when his name comes up, the response is different. Not celebratory. Not condemnatory. Cautious. Reflective. People pause before speaking. That pause is new. It's the space where certainty used to live. And that space is where accountability begins. Hollywood didn't collapse. It adapted. But adaptation came with an unspoken lesson. Audiences are no longer passive recipients of institutional judgment. They observe patterns. They remember contradictions. They don't forget who was discarded quickly and who was protected carefully. This story isn't about restoring an old hierarchy. It's about witnessing a shift. One where silence can challenge power more effectively than outrage. Where survival itself becomes a form of resistance. And where moving on is no longer a unilateral decision. Hollywood tried to move on. But moving on now requires trust. And trust, once cracked, doesn't seal itself just because time passes. What followed after that pause was something Hollywood has always struggled with. Reflection without control. When a system loses the ability to guide interpretation, it becomes reactive. Executives watched as audience conversations matured without studio framing. People weren't asking who to cancel next. They were asking why decisions had been rushed in the first place. That question is far more dangerous than outrage, because it doesn't burn out quickly. This is where the industry's old playbook failed completely. In the past, controversy would peak, attention would shift, and silence would do the cleanup. But silence only works when the audience is willing to forget. This time, forgetting felt irresponsible. Too many receipts existed. Too many hours of unedited footage. Too many contradictions between early headlines and later evidence. The memory stayed active. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was how ordinary the response became. There was no cult-like defense. No coordinated campaign. Just individuals saying the same thing in different ways. This doesn't add up. When enough people reach the conclusion independently, narrative control collapses. Hollywood didn't lose authority because of one actor. It lost authority because it underestimated collective pattern recognition. Behind the scenes, talent agencies quietly adjusted their advice. Younger actors were warned about how quickly support can vanish. Private conversations shifted from "protect your image" to "document everything." Legal awareness entered creative spaces that once relied on trust. That shift alone tells you how deeply the moment landed. Fear didn't disappear. It just changed direction. For the first time, the risk wasn't association with controversy. It was association with unfairness. Brands noticed. Executives noticed. When public trust begins to outweigh public approval, marketing strategies lose their edge. You can't slogan your way out of skepticism. And skepticism had settled in. Depp's continued distance from Hollywood's center amplified that effect. He didn't rush back to reassure anyone. He didn't validate the system that sidelined him by begging to rejoin it. Instead, he chose projects that existed outside the usual prestige circuit. Smaller films, international collaborations, creative work where permission wasn't required. Each appearance reminded audiences that legitimacy doesn't originate from one place. This forced an uncomfortable realization. Hollywood doesn't create relevance. It amplifies it. And amplification only works when the source still resonates. In this case, resonance survived without the amplifier. That inversion rattled long-held assumptions about power. If relevance can exist independently, then control is an illusion maintained by habit. Public conversation eventually shifted away from the individual and toward the mechanism. People began recognizing how easily moral certainty is manufactured when speed is prioritized over verification. Outrage feels productive. It gives the impression of action. But action without accuracy creates collateral damage. Once that damage becomes visible, trust erodes quietly and permanently. There was no moment where the industry collectively admitted fault. There never is. Institutions don't apologize for reflexes. They update procedures and pretend that was always the plan. But audiences aren't fooled by silent revisions. They notice when language changes, when behavior softens, when certainty disappears from statements that once sounded absolute. The most revealing part of this entire chapter is what didn't happen. There was no coordinated effort to silence discussion, no aggressive counter-narrative, no attempt to overwhelm curiosity with distraction. Because the tactic no longer works. Information doesn't bottleneck anymore. It spreads laterally, peer-to-peer, and lateral spread is immune to authority. Over time, the phrase, "we didn't know enough yet," began surfacing in conversations where once there had been declarations. That sentence is small, but it represents a massive cultural shift. It admits limitation. And admission of limitation is something power structures avoid at all costs. Yet here it was, slipping into public discourse. Depp didn't force that shift. He outlasted the attempt to erase him. Endurance did the work. Consistency did the work. Refusing to reshape himself for approval did the work. And that's why this story unsettles so many people who rely on control. It proves that patience can undermine authority more effectively than protest. Hollywood is still moving forward. It always will. But it moves differently now. Slower in some places. Quieter in others. More cautious with declarations that can't be reversed. The confidence it once projected hasn't disappeared, but it's been tempered by memory. Memory of a moment when the audience didn't follow. This isn't a redemption tale. It's a warning wrapped in real time. About what happens when institutions confuse influence with ownership. About how easily systems forget the humans they depend on. And about how difficult it is to regain trust once it's been spent recklessly. Hollywood tried to move on as if nothing fundamental had been challenged. But something had. The assumption that silence equals compliance. The belief that time automatically favors power. The idea that narratives can be closed without consent. They tried to move on. But the story didn't let them. If you stayed till here, you already know this story isn't simple. Now I want to hear your take. Did Hollywood act too fast, or was the damage unavoidable once the narrative locked in? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, because this conversation only matters when different perspectives exist. If you value long-form storytelling that doesn't rush judgment and doesn't insult your intelligence, support the channel by hitting like and subscribe. More deep dives like this are coming, where facts, context, and human consequences matter more than headlines. Stay curious, not compliant.